Thank you. Welcome back. This is the fourth session we've had for our Washington Policy Summit. We started early this morning with a leading epidemiologist. We had sessions on the policy response to COVID-19 and then just ended session on economic outlook. Now we turn to the election. It's hard to believe there actually is an election. It seems that everything is so overshadowed by the pandemic that the politicians and the race itself has been pushed to the back pages. Today, and in this session, we're going to tease out the key issues in the campaign. And we're doing it with some of the leading experts on polling and political outlook. We have with us today Libby Cantrell, who's the managing director and head of public policy at PIMCO, Carol Doherty, who's the director of political research at the Pew Research Center, and Stuart Rothenberg, founder and editor and publisher of the Rothenberg and Gonzalez Political Report. Their full bios are on our app, and I suggest you use our app because that's how you'll send in your questions as the discussion ripens over the next 45 minutes. And I do encourage those of you watching to send in questions. Thanks to all of you for being with us here today. 8 weeks ago, the race looked very different. The U.S. economy was experiencing the longest expansion in modern history. Unemployment was at a 50-year low. The White House was feeling pretty good about the economic conditions. The Democrats seemed to be in a splintered race. There was discord and acrimony. It was fragmented. And there was enormous partisanship. We had just concluded an impeachment of the president. But now this morning we see that 22 million first-time filers for unemployment. The economic indicators are in a free fall. The Democrats have actually rallied around former Vice President Biden. Just this week, we've seen Bernie Sanders, former President Obama, and Elizabeth Warren, as well as some of the leading young progressives endorse Biden. So the party seems to have gelled around their candidates. And there is some bipartisanship. We've seen three legislative packages and potentially a fourth one in the pipeline come together. The speed with which I have not seen in Washington in my 30-plus years here. So in just a matter of weeks, the dynamics of this race has changed remarkably. So let's go to you, the experts, to give us a sense of where you see the race today, how you see their most recent polling, and then we'll spend a few minutes talking about where we are today, and then we'll turn our lens looking more forward and better understand how the next 201 days are going to play out. Carol, why don't we start with you, and then we'll turn to Stu, and then we'll go to Libby. And again, thank you all for joining me here today.
Well, thank you. It's been a wild few weeks, obviously. And I mean, amidst all this turmoil with the pandemic and the pandemic overshadowing almost everything else, as you say, some of the data, really the political data, at least on a national level, hasn't changed all that much. As you say, there are kind of signs of bipartisanship. We see it in our polling where you see state and local officials getting really high marks for their handling of the coronavirus outbreak. You see high marks for health professionals, CDC, Anthony Fauci. Bipartisanship in action there in terms of attitudes. But then you come to President Trump and his ratings don't look a lot different than they did a few months ago. Now he had a little bit of bump in his approval rating the first weeks of the crisis. That seems to have receded. He's back around the low 40% range. The Biden-Trump matchups early on, which are to be taken with a big grain of salt, some small edge for Biden overall among registered voters. This, of course, avoids the question of turnout, which is so crucial, and we're 7 months away from that. And so in some ways, the patterns look a little similar to the early stages of 2016, even though the environment is turned upside down. Now, what are we going to be watching over the next few months? We're watching, certainly Trump's handling of this crisis, who is ultimately responsible for this crisis, how the public sees that, how voters see that. Questions about the logistics of the election itself, given, as you say, the possibility for a second wave of fall. We saw what happened in Wisconsin, the long lines there. And then the legitimacy of the election itself. I mean, barring an Obama type of margin in 2008, it's hard to imagine that the losing side isn't going to have some criticism, complaint, or questions about the legitimacy of the election.
Great. Stu, and then we'll turn to you, Libby.
Thanks, Tim. Well, interestingly, I think if you look over the last couple of months, the most important event politically is actually not COVID-19, although I don't want to minimize it. It's having a huge impact on people daily, and the impact will grow. But it actually was the virtual end of the Democratic race, where Democrats rallied behind a broadly acceptable candidate, Joe Biden, instead of an ideologue, Bernie Sanders, who would have changed the Trump strategy completely and given an opening to the president during the campaign. And so I think the Biden nomination is a huge deal in making it much more difficult for the president to hold on to his coalition or to expand the coalition or to get back some swing voters that he lost in the 2018 midterm elections, particularly college-educated white women. And when we look at what's happened over the past few months in terms of Democratic primaries, even a state Senate, a Supreme Court election in Wisconsin, we see the Democratic turnout is through the roof, very strong. And in a state where Wisconsin was supposed to have a toss-up Supreme Court race, the Democrat won by 10 points. I think you see kind of the bigger problems that the president has. I look for a rally around the flag effect after this COVID hit, which is normally a significant surge in presidential support as Americans rally around the president, who is not a partisan figure, who is not an ideological figure, but he stands for national unity, national strength, succeeding over all the problems we have. And I saw no surge. I saw, normally when you talk about the rally around the flag, you're talking about a bump in 10, 20, 30 points for presidents who already have job approval in the low 50s. This president has his job approval has been in the low to mid 40s. But what did I see? I saw a gain of 2 points maybe, and now they're falling back. So where do I see the race? Pretty clearly, I think Joe Biden has a narrow lead, but a clear lead. He has the advantage. The president has the megaphone. The president will run a very aggressive campaign to define, using a neutral word, to define Joe Biden, discredit Joe Biden, destroy Joe Biden. The president needs the Democrat to have high negatives to win. That's what happened 2016. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be a competitive race. It's going to come down to 6 or 8 states, no more than that. I often tell people who live in New York and California and Alabama and Mississippi that I'm sure they're very nice people. They're just irrelevant in terms of the 2020 presidential race. It's coming down to the key states. And we'll see what happens. I expect a competitive race.
I'll turn to you, Olivia. But the rally around the flag is interesting. I experienced it myself. I worked in Bush 41. And I remember being on the South Lawn of the White House in 91 when Bush 41 had a 90% approval rating and went on to lose. And then after 9/11, President Bush 43, we had approval ratings in almost 80%. And of course, that dissipated over time. And with Katrina and other events, it completely disappeared. So the durability of even a large mob is one of questionable nature. Libby, how do you see it from your perspective? What are the markets saying? And are you so focused, is PIMCO and other institutions still focused on just responding to the economic calamities that we're seeing? Is politics still an important part of the discussion?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks, Tim. And thanks so much for having me here. And I hope everybody who's watching this conference is all healthy and safe and staying relatively sane, homebound. So, I think that the way that, we've been talking about this to our clients, going into 2020, President Trump was a relatively formidable candidate. He has a lot of the powers of the incumbency. He obviously has the bully pulpit, which right now he is using extensively, his hour or 2-hour press conference every afternoon. Meanwhile, Biden is broadcasting from his basement. So I think it's something that cannot be underestimated, is just the strength of the bully pulpit. He has organization. He has an incredible digital strategy. I mean, he has 76 million followers on Twitter, but also a very sophisticated digital campaign strategy. He has massive fundraising advantage, 220 million with his campaign, and then with the RNC. And then he also has an incredibly loyal and fervent base, and we've seen that his floor is very stable. So I think going into this, he's going to be a pretty formidable incumbent. But I do think COVID has changed the dynamic here, and of course, Tim, this, and so does other folks, that the only incumbent presidents who have not been reelected in recent history have been those who have overseen a recession within 2 years of the election. So that was Ford, Carter, and then of course George H.W. Bush. That you kind of add to that and you sort of unpack that. And as Stuart said, this really will come down to sort of 6 to 8 states. And I think we probably would argue that there are 3 of those states are most important: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And particularly in Pennsylvania and Michigan, you have seen the COVID economic collapse just be dramatic. And, according to unemployment claims, 1 out of 5 workers in both Michigan and Pennsylvania have filed for unemployment insurance. And so that is a massive headwind, I would argue, in those states. And then also, just in terms of your point about rallying around the flag and sort of the durability of that very tiny bump that we saw, if President Trump, who was, somewhat elected on this narrative of competence and a businessman, if there are more reports that, perhaps the federal response wasn't as competent, wasn't as fulsome as should have been, I think that also will be a headwind. So that's sort of how we're thinking about it. I think that, the punchline, though, is that this is going to be a close race. It will come down just a few states. And I think watching the economic metrics in those states are going to be very important. To your question about markets, though, I don't think markets are focused on this. The markets are focused on COVID, on sort of the durability of this, economic downturn, whether, when and if we return into some sort of normalcy before the end of the year. I don't really think markets will sort of pivot to this probably until sort of the convention time, kind of late summer. Now, just lastly, I would just say that markets will be much more focused on this, and sort of to Stuart's point, if Bernie Sanders were the nominee. I think the fact that if Biden is a nominee, that cut a massive tail risk in the markets. I think prevented sort of a lot of, downside in the markets. So I think the markets, and now that, Joe Biden will be the nominee, sort of has pivoted again the focus just to COVID and the election. I don't think will really matter until probably, July, August at the earliest.
Thank you, Libby. You raised a good point. You mentioned Bernie Sanders. Let me just talk a little bit, or ask the question about where's the progressive movement. We saw all the energy on the Democrat side with Elizabeth Warren, with Bernie Sanders, huge crowds, lots of enthusiasm. Not so much for Joe Biden. He was seen as a safe pair of hands, and I assume that's right. Where does all that energy go? And more importantly, what about the policy agenda of the progressives? The Green New Deal, especially focused on climate, social justice, healthcare for all, Medicare for all, free higher education. In an era in which we're spending trillions over the next few weeks, massive budget deficits, is the progressive agenda going to be a durable topic over the next 200 days, or is it run out of steam? I'll go to Carol and Stu.
Well, I think, one of the things we've seen is again, not to harp on COVID, but what is the impact of COVID on people's attitudes about the social safety net? I mean, we've seen polling for the stimulus packages overwhelming support. People think that there's a need for another stimulus package. So in terms of deficits, debts, those have been forgotten, at least by the public at this point, probably by policymakers. And so what does this mean in the long term? Does it mean kind of more of a kind of trigger for a progressive support for progressive agenda? Even in our polling, we saw before in January, prior to the primaries, Democratic primaries, pretty strong support for things like free college, Medicare for all, at least the option of Medicare for all, things like that. So does this really stimulate kind of a progressive movement among the public, especially among millennials and Gen Z, who are being hit so hard by this crisis?
Stu, what about?
I would add that between now and the Democratic convention, assuming there is a convention or some sort of convention, you'll see progressives pushing their agendas. They try to pull Joe Biden to the left on a variety of issues, as you mentioned, whether it's environmental, climate change kinds of things or economic. And that will go on because that's the nature of politics. They understand that the party platform and the party agenda are important, and they're going to push on that. And you're going to see a lot of articles. I wrote about one recently in Roll Call, where young progressive groups said we're not going to support Joe Biden automatically. He's got to adopt the Sanders agenda, which is kind of ridiculous because he was nominated because he wasn't proposing the Sanders agenda. But I think you have to give Sanders supporters some time to accept Bernie Sanders' exit from the race. I mean, people were very emotionally committed to him. And the fact that he dropped out is such a bummer to them that I wouldn't expect them to support Joe Biden right away. But the closer we get to November, the more the Democratic message will be the U.S. Supreme Court. Who do you want on the Supreme Court? Who do you want choosing nominees? Who do you want running the country? Donald Trump. And really the best thing Joe Biden has going for himself, the absolute best thing, is the fact that the country is so polarized and 52% of the country hates Donald Trump. Now, that could change, of course, and when we have the campaign. But I think sooner or later, most of the progressives, not all, absolutely not all, but most of the progressives will line up behind Joe Biden just because, I mean, it was different 4 years ago. Donald Trump was unknown. People said, well, when he became president, maybe he'd be different. And Hillary and Donald Trump, there's no difference between them. Now the progressives have seen how the president has governed, and I think they're frightened enough that they'll line up behind Biden eventually.
So the rhetoric is still one of the ascendancy of progressivism. We'll still hear about inequality, which we're going to witness firsthand given the economic impact of this crisis. But ultimately, it's up to Biden to try to steer the party back to a more palatable Democratic, a pro-growth mainstream party.
He can still talk about equity, about fairness, about climate change, about healthcare. I mean, his themes are not going to be that different from Bernie. His specific proposals are different, and he has a different outlook, what many people would say are more realistic or pragmatic. But no, he's going to touch on the same kinds of issues, I think, that any Democrat would talk about.
Libby, are the markets, are we going to be exhausted by the amount of government we're seeing every single day on the headlines? How will the business community, the investor community see the prospect of a progressive agenda, even if it's on the sidelines, even if it's throwaway lines? Is it too much for us going forward? Have we had enough government?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have not seen the rates market, for instance, move at all on, this massive, really unprecedented, the biggest, fiscal package that we have ever passed in the history of the United States. The rates market, the interest rates market, barely, budged. And that's because, the United States still has the advantage of being the reserve currency of the world. Even though interest rates are very low in the United States, they are actually nominally higher than they are basically everywhere else in the developed world. And so the U.S. bonds continue to be, a nice hedge to risk. And there continues just to be, massive appetite for U.S. Treasury bonds. And so this idea that, this is going to catch up to us, maybe it will. Lots of people for, 2 decades have been talking about the fact that deficits do matter in the end. We just haven't seen, that actually manifest itself in the market. So for now, I don't think that I think the market welcomed the stimulus package. I think you saw a big relief rally in risk assets when the stimulus package was passed. I think that in this case, they are very much welcoming sort of the government stepping in and providing stimulative support to the economy. Now, fast forward to 2021, when people go back to their partisan corners, and depending on who is in control, I'm sure that there will be more of a tendency to second guess some of that. But as of now, I think the markets and as Carolyn Stewart said, constituents and voters also welcomed it as well.
Thank you. We're getting some questions in. And for those of you who are viewing who want to ask questions, please use the app. It comes right to me and I'll filter it into our conversation. A couple of questions really about back to topics on policy, healthcare. Given this is a healthcare crisis, and I'll give to Carol, Stu, whoever wants to chime in. Given this is a health infrastructure crisis, a healthcare crisis, public health crisis, might we see more movement toward more acceptance, more demand for more healthcare, greater healthcare safety net? Maybe is that a topic where the progressives actually may resonate over the coming 200 days? Carol, Stu?
Right. I mean, it's hard to know. I think that's a second order effect, and we're still in the first order stage of a lot of this COVID reactions, people trying to get tested when they can't get tested and things like that, just basic government competence in trying to manage this crisis. But I did, among other issues, the issue agenda among Democrats, we did a big study of this in January, and, there weren't huge differences, but that was one. The idea of getting rid of private insurance, that's one that divides the Democratic Party, and Biden has come down on the other side of that. And I think most Democrats, would prefer this Medicare option, and that seems to have broad support within the party. I think that's an acceptable position. You'll still see progressives, lobby for the Sanders position, but I think that's a position that probably has some legs through this campaign.
I'm going to ask you the same question. May I just add a wrinkle to it, throw down a second question, which is, will this crisis make us more partisan? Will it intensify polarization, or might it force us to be more unified as a country? So healthcare and a general mood question.
Jim, you mean it's possible to be more partisan? What would that look like? People shooting at one another during the day and walking down the street and punching one another? Well, I'm skeptical that it will result in more bipartisanship. I mean, you have correct cooperation on emergency stimulus with millions of people, 20 million people filing for unemployment over the last month or something. I don't think that suggests a fundamental shift, mainly because I watch the president every day in his press conferences, and they don't look bipartisan to me. They don't look like he's changed his tone. He is who he is, and Pelosi is, how she's going to respond, and Schumer, how he's going to respond. So, no, I don't think we're going to head to more bipartisanship. I mean, in the short term, everybody realizes there's a tragedy developing here, and we want to stop it. As to the first part of the question, policy is of course very important. It's very important to people who are watching us now. But I think rather than focus on the policy, the politicians will focus on the process. And by that, I mean, we've entered the stage with an extended period in the narrative that's going to be about who is at fault, who made what mistakes. And this is going to take up a lot of the discussion over the next few weeks and months, instead of debating the intricacies of public policy, Medicare for all versus this system versus that. But you're going to see a narrative based much more on, what are the Democrats trying to slow down the stimulus dollars coming in? Did the president know? What did he know? When did he know it about the virus? And so I think that's going to lead to more finger pointing and more partisanship rather than less.
That's a great segue to you, Libby. One of the messages coming from the president is this was an imported crisis, right? And it's because of China, it's because of the World Health Organization, it's because of the Europeans. That fits the president's narrative over the past 3 or 4 years, actually much of his life, which is it's about isolationism, protectionism, xenophobia. Markets and private institutions like trade. We like open markets. We like the capacity to free flow of capital, free flow of business. Might we see the idea of trade and China and international institutions come under even greater fire over the next few months?
Yeah, and I think in some ways, President Trump, maybe smartly, is already laying the groundwork for some of the attacks against Biden on what President Trump will characterize as Biden's more sympathetic approach to China during his time in the Obama administration. Vice President Biden, for instance, was a huge advocate for Trans-Pacific Partnership, for basically every other trade deal. He was in the Senate for almost 4 decades. I mean, he has a very long public record that is more friendly towards free trade, that I think could and probably will be used against him going into the general election. And I think in some ways, President Trump, China has always been sort of a convenient boogeyman for the president, but also, and I think Stuart and Carol probably say this, and I agree with Stuart's characterization of the lack of bipartisanship, but one of the most bipartisan issues right now on Capitol Hill over the last few years has been, sort of suspicion and skepticism around China. And the Democrats have a kind of a different kind of approach towards that skepticism, but it's kind of results in the same outcome. So in many ways, President Trump and Democrats on the Hill are strange bedfellows in terms of sort of their, antipathy is probably too strong of a word, but I guess suspicion or skepticism about China in general. So I think the point is that with, President Trump already trying to lay blame on China for the coronavirus, for maybe not stopping as much as they should have, suppressing data, what have you. I think he is just going to use that in many ways as sort of a platform then to attack Biden for, again, this more sympathetic approach towards China. Whether that's true or not, President Trump is a master in terms of kind of creating the narrative. And again, this is a big advantage that an incumbent president has. They have the time and they have the opportunity to sort of define their opponent. Obama did it with Romney, Bush did it with Kerry, and I think that Trump will obviously do it with Biden as well. And I think China, a long way of saying, will be a big sort of focus of that opposition and of trying to define Biden.
Carol, that's a great segue into you. Can the president shift the blame, or ultimately does the buck stops with him? He owns it. He's the man in the White House. He's in control. Will the voters let him find a scapegoat?
Well, that's the question over the next few months, as Stu said, is this responsibility question. I don't think it's clear. Certainly, Trump is pointing to governors in China and every other actor except for the White House. Voters are inclined, the data I've seen is that the voters are inclined to give the administration some blame, and even Republicans are giving, in these early stages, giving Trump and the White House some blame for this crisis. But is that enough over the long term to move them away from Trump in the general election? That's the question. But it's clearly there's a good bit of sentiment that the White House has mishandled this crisis, at least in the early weeks.
Tim, if I could, I would answer it. I would answer it similarly, but slightly differently. And that's this: really, you're asking a question that is this election going to be a choice between the two candidates or a referendum on Donald Trump? And we know midterm elections are always referenda on the sitting president. They're always, whether the economy is good or bad, or the president's popular or unpopular, it's always about the president. And presidential elections are often choices between two candidates to see which one is less unpopular. But in this case, I think the election is more likely to be a referendum on the president for this reason, well, for a number of reasons. But He's on the television every minute of every day. He is suffocatingly present in each of our lives. He's on the front page of the newspaper every day. I wake up and I tell people, I know that today's going to be crazier than yesterday because yesterday was crazier than the day before, and the day before was crazier than the day before that. The president's great weakness and or was probably a strength for him and his supporters is he thrives on chaos, on creating chaos. He was elected to create chaos by a plurality of Americans who were sick and tired of the status quo, sick and tired of promises from politicians. They wanted dramatic change, and he promised it, and he has given that. The problem is that dramatic change is supported by between 41 and 45% of the American public. I think that he's done a good job. They approve of his performance. The ballot test, he's around 43, 44. That's not ideal for a president seeking re-election. And he's just such a strong figure. And in a sense, the freeze of the last month in politics actually benefits Biden. It gives Biden a chance not to screw up over the past few weeks and next few months, which, there's a significant risk of that happening too. So as long as the election is a referendum on the president, he has problems.
I love that phrase, too.
Please, Carol,
suffocatingly present. I want to.
So Biden is the Coolidge of our era. He's sitting on his front porch, silently waiting for an opportunity to speak. But, and I'm going to come back to you, Libby, just a second about China, because I've gotten several questions. But when do Americans get tired of the style? When do they want this reality television show to be canceled? How many more seasons can we stand? How much more drama? Isn't there exhaustion? You're exhausted from it. I'm exhausted. When does American people say, you know what, I've had it. I want to go back to normality, whatever that means? Stu, Carol, anyone?
Carol, why don't you?
I'm struck by a statistic from the 2016 campaign where 70% of Republican voters said that Trump had gotten too much media attention, including 33% of Trump supporters who said that they were getting a little exhausted at that time, and that was 4 years ago. No, but I do think the exhaustion is there. We've asked people if they're exhausted by Trump. Majorities say they are. But the Trump presidency comes down to, even in non-election times, always seems to come down for Republican voters, at least to a binary choice. And so I'm exhausted by him. I'm concerned by him. I'm embarrassed by him sometimes, but I stick with him, so far at least.
I would just add, when you look at the Trump coalition, it is essentially holding. There's been some leakage here and there, but not a widespread disdain for the president and a fleeing from him. So if you look at white evangelicals, if you look at rural voters, if you look at self-described conservatives and self-described Republicans, self-identified Republicans, these voters, they may be tired. Some of them may be tired of Trump, and they may not like the language he uses. And they might say, can you tweet a little less? But I think Carol's exactly right. At the end of the day, they see the choices between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, AOC, democratic socialism. And as long as they see that choice, then they're going to stay behind the president.
Hey, Tim,
the question is the rest of the voters. I'm sorry, Libby, go ahead.
Sorry, and I was just gonna. I'm obviously we're not pollsters at PIMCO, but one big conclusion from the 2018 midterm election was that there was a lot of opportunity among, especially suburban women, and Democrats in the House, picked up the House by suburban women coming out. Previously Republican voters switching and voting for the Democratic candidate. So I think while all of that is true that, President Trump has a sort of Teflon base, I think, his floor is very stable, but his ceiling may not be that high. And there is a lot of opportunity here for Vice President Biden to speak to those more kind of independent voters, especially suburban women. So I think, the Biden campaign will likely start revving up their focus and their micro-targeting on that demographic in particular in places like, again, Pennsylvania, and Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona. Those states will be incredibly important to the.
I just want to make it clear that I agree completely that, and I've written that the two key elements in the 2020 election are white college-educated women, particularly in the suburbs, upscale women in the suburbs, and Democratic turnout levels among younger voters, African Americans, Latinos, and progressives. So, and right now, both of those things seem to be working well for Joe Biden and the Democrats, and that's why I started off why I said, and I continue to believe, the race leans to Biden. I'm sorry.
I'm going to come back to turnout in just a second. But Libby, I have a specific question for you, and that's come in over the app, and that is about China. And could Trump impose new tariffs on China, new trade sanctions, and maybe not China, but just generally to make it sound tough on those outside the United States? And would there be an optimal time to rhetorically attack China over the coming weeks and months? How do you see the China debate going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, one that our clients continue to ask as well. And really, the day that President Trump was inaugurated, even though I think there was sort of this narrative in the markets, at least, that President Trump was talking about trade and protectionism because he wanted to win states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I think folks really did underestimate the sort of sincerity and how fundamental this view is for the president. I mean, President Trump has been talking about United States getting short shrifted on trade since the mid 1980s. And this is, I think, by his own admission, because he was a business person. He didn't come to the White House with much sort of strong public policy views, but this one is incredibly strong and deep-seated for the president. So what I've been talking to our investment committee and to our clients about really since 2017 was you do not underestimate the president on trade policy. He sincerely believes this. And of course, as we have seen, most things you need Congress to do, but trade policy is one of those areas where Congress, maybe regretfully at this point, has bequeathed a lot of authority to the executive branch. And so I think this will absolutely be, at least in terms of rhetoric, President Trump will kind of rhetorically go back to tariffs if COVID doesn't just completely absorb the entire kind of campaign narrative, if we are back to some sort of sense of some normalcy in kind of September, October, I think you absolutely could see him once again sort of saber rattling against China. And again, he thinks this is where Vice President Biden is vulnerable, because he has had this long public record of supporting free trade agreements, and because he was really the sort of the spokesperson for the Obama administration on trade. So long way of saying, like, absolutely, do I think this is a well that President Trump will continue to go back to during the campaign, but also importantly, if he were reelected. Something auto tariffs has been something that the president has been talking about against Japan since 1980. I think he really wants to impose tariffs on autos. I think many people in his staff have encouraged him not to do that. But I think this could be yet another theme that we see in 2021 should the president be reelected, because again, he fundamentally believes this, and there's a lot of evidence and polling, I think Carol can speak to this, that supports the president on these issues. And again, he thinks that that's the big vulnerability for Joe Biden.
I agree with that, Carol. I'm gonna you can also follow on that, but I also have a question about independent voters. What role do they play? And I asked the question. I see the reference that the largest voting bloc is independent voters. But then I read that actually there are no independent voters. They either lean right, they lean left. Right. It's a bit of a misnomer. Can you help us in just a minute or two understand who are the independent voters, and are they truly independent? What do they care about?
Well, they're self-described independent voters, and some people really do gravitate towards that label of being, quote, independent. But as you say, many of them most of them, in fact, are closet partisans. And when you look at their attitudes, the Republican-leaning independents tend to share the same views as Republicans on Donald Trump and major issues, and Democratic-leaning independents do the same with Democrats. I mean, the odd thing is that those independents who, even when pressed, don't lean are not up for grabs necessarily. More disengaged politically, young people, people who don't vote frequently, things like that. About 10% of all independents have no partisan leaning, but they tend not to participate in the political process.
Stu, I have a question for you about urban voters, and it says, what would urban voters in key states turnout look like? Do they vote? Will they vote? Will the passion be maintained in November? So urban voters in the 6 or 8 states. Stu?
Well, so far, again, when we look at the primaries that we've had and we've looked at special elections and the like, we're seeing strong Democratic turnout. Urban voters, I'm not sure what the questioner means, whether he or she is particularly referring to voters of color, non-whites, or whatever. But so urban voters is a key core of the Democratic coalition, and they are turning out in big numbers. The Milwaukee County numbers the other day in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, the Wisconsin primary election were stunningly big. So I think Democrats are energized. I think they just to reiterate a point I made before, 4 years ago, nobody knew what a Donald Trump presidency would be like. And Hillary Clinton was a very polarizing figure, and some progressives didn't trust her. I always joke around by saying progressives thought that Hillary Clinton would rather go out to lunch with Jamie Dimon than to talk to community activists, and who wouldn't? But now, after 4 years of the president and Supreme Court nominees and his language and tone, I don't think Democrats have to worry about turnout among urban voters. Younger voters is a different thing. I've grown old waiting for 18 to 29-year-olds to start to vote. They always say they vote. They're very passionate. They're very vocal, and then they never vote. But urban voters are a little different.
I agree. Every election I ever worked on, we always said, let's go get the youth vote, and they never show up. It's a reminder. We keep talking about the 6 or 8 states that matter, 5 states. Many of our viewers today are from outside the United States. Can the three of you remind our viewers, it's about the Electoral College, not about the popular vote, right? Which confuses some people. But what are the states that matter? What states, maybe starting with the most important, what states should we be paying attention to? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I think. Well, I'm not the pollster, so they can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think from our view, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan are probably the top 3 most important states, followed by Arizona, Florida, and then I think it probably, and again, Carol and Stuart can correct me here. Ohio, North Carolina. All important, but I think those 3, top ones will be, the most important. And then Tim, this isn't a question that you asked, but maybe we could just in the remaining, 1 minute. I just wanted to just reinforce how important it is that not only the White House is obviously at stake in this election, but also, the direction of Congress, and that you're going to be talking about sort of some of the economic policies that we might see in 2021 in the next panel, I believe. And I just want to kind of reinforce how important the composition of Congress is. While the White House race is the most kind of sexy, most, interesting to watch, the run for Congress and the dominance of who's going to actually, win the Senate and who's going to win the House is very important. And in that, I think the House, looks pretty safe for Democrats. Maybe they lose a couple of seats. But the Senate, which is controlled by Republicans right now, 53 to 47, is absolutely in play. And critically, going back to your question about the swing states, there are some very critical, competitive Senate races in states like North Carolina, like Arizona. And so, watching, again, the White House is important, but in terms of an economic policy and from a markets perspective, actually who controls Congress, which parties can control Congress, I would argue is just as important. Maybe not as fun to watch, but just as important.
I agree. And my inbox is full of campaign solicitations from both the Senate and the House campaign committees. We have just a minute left, both from Carol and Stu. what states should we be watching for, and any thoughts about following what Libby just said about the down ballot races? Carol, and then
just briefly, the big six, I think, as Libby identified them. To that, I would maybe add Minnesota, which is a state that has the demographics that favor Trump a little bit, and Clinton only won narrowly in 2016. And then, of course, the main Senate race, which everyone is watching with Susan Collins.
All right, we lost Carol. Stu?
I'd say the top three are Wisconsin, and Wisconsin. And then after that, Arizona are the ones to look at, along with the other states that Libby and Carol mentioned. It's all about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is going to be narrower than the popular vote. It would be possible for Joe Biden to win the popular vote by 5 million votes and still lose the election. So keep the focus on these key states. And I agree with Libby. The House is likely to remain Democratic. The Senate is probably a toss-up, and it'll be a firefight in the final few months.
Great. Libby, Carol, Sue, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure seeing you. I really appreciate your time today. It's been a great conversation. I wish we had more time, but we'll do it again sometime soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. And stay safe, please. Bye-bye.